I finished 10 books this October, and there's a first for me this month because of those 10 books, I finished books by the authors that I consider my top 5 favorite authors right now. Stephen King, Robin Hobb, Guy Gavriel Kay, Michael Connelly, and John Steinbeck. So with those 5 authors plus 5 other books, let's just say the competition for Book of the Month was fierce. Welcome to my October book reviews. I'm going to share with you short reviews of the 10 books that I finished in the 10th month of the year. As always, I will put timestamps below as I will group these reviews by genre, and the book of the month will be last. Let's go ahead and start with a new author to me that may end up becoming an all-time favorite. The author is Christopher Ruocchio, and the book was Empire of Silence. This is the first book in the Sun Eater saga, and if you watch any BookTube at all, you've probably heard about this book, but just in case you haven't, let me tell you a little bit about this. This is the first in a 7-book series that Ruocchio is currently writing the 7th book, and it's a first-person narration by Hadrian Marlowe, who apparently killed an entire alien species, and he's telling the story that leads up to that. And this is very much a coming-of-age tale. It's a first-person narrative, and I really enjoyed this book. This is science fiction, but it's more sci-fantasy. It gave me total Dune vibes, which you know I love that, and I would say that Ruocchio kind of wears his influences on his sleeve and really leans into that because there was a lot you could tell was heavily influenced by Dune. It took me a little bit to get into this story, though. Part of it was the writing style was a bit different than I was expecting. I'd heard a lot of really positive things about Ruocchio's writing style, and I'm not going to refute that, but there's often a little bit of a disconnect or a disjunct nature to the way that the story unfolds and the way that he's telling it. Most of the time, Ruocchio writes in a very kind of straightforward, I wouldn't say direct, but very clear prose style. And it's very direct, and it's easy to kind of let the pages turn, and it just propels you to the next chapter. You have kind of short chapters. But on the other hand, there are these long passages of this really poetic and purple prose that I felt was a bit jarring at times. As I got further into the book, what I feel that Ruocchio's doing in those moments, I feel what he's doing is he's the old man, Hadrian Marlowe, looking back on his life, and he's kind of waxing poetic a little bit. But for me, it was a bit jarring because it almost felt like there were kind of 2 authors at play at times in this book. But the main character, Hadrian Marlowe, he can tend to be a little bit dramatic or even a little bit melodramatic. So those passages that I found a little bit jarring at first actually helped the story, helped us inform the character a little bit about his story. And it's a really good tale. He starts with, he's in a noble house and he's trying to get out of the noble house basically because his father's making him do some things he doesn't want to do. And then he ends up in a situation which is much worse than where he found himself originally. And it's a story that goes a lot of different directions. But by the end, you can see where the overall story of the Sun Eater saga is going to go. I don't recall the last time I read a book this big so quickly. It's almost 700 pages, and I think I read this in 3 or 4 days because I just couldn't put it down. It had such narrative momentum. It was such a compelling story that I really enjoyed it, and I'm most excited to continue with this series because when I talked about this with others on the Fireside Discord, pretty much everyone said that it gets really good after book 1. And I thought book 1 was really good. So I'm really excited for the Sun Eater saga. I'll be reading something by Ruocchio every month leading up to hopefully when book 7 comes out next year. But I'll be reading The Lesser Devil next month and then book 2, Howling Dark, in December. But I really enjoyed Empire of Silence, and I'm really looking forward to more Ruocchio. I finished up my month by reading Tortilla Flats by John Steinbeck. This is advertised as Steinbeck's kind of take on King Arthur and his knights and Camelot, and you can see the parallels. He kind of leans into that. And the kind of storytelling is actually almost a throwback as well. But honestly, it didn't remind me so much of that. It reminded me of something else, maybe because I haven't read La Morte d'Arthur, the original, but from, I guess, kind of antiquated times, a piece of literature that I've read that this reminded me of was actually Don Quixote. you have all of these, you have some very colorful characters in here, and this is kind of his Camelot set in California, and the knights are all World War I veterans, and they're all paisanos, and maybe with the kind of Spanish influence in there, it led me into thinking of Don Quixote as I was reading this, but also just the way the story was told. Almost each chapter was almost like its own little vignette, and the chapter titles even reminded me of kind of that kind of storytelling where it would say, Don Quixote and Sancho do this, this, this. And you would get similar chapter titles in here that were kind of like a sentence and everything. And even though it is a through narrative, it did almost feel like a lot of these chapters were almost kind of like self-contained, very short stories. It's not one of Steinbeck's best, in my opinion. This is my 12th work of his that I've read, but it's somewhere in the middle, and it's certainly very, very good. Some very colorful characters came to life on this one. I enjoyed a lot of the parallels when you saw some of the characters and you think of some of the knights in King Arthur's Tales and some of their stories, how he kind of changed it to an early 20th century setting. It was very clever, and some of the themes lined up as well. It's a really quick read and definitely one not to skip. If you haven't read the big ones by Steinbeck, I wouldn't put this one ahead of the line. But if you've read Of Mice and Men, East of Eden, Grapes of Wrath, Tortilla Flat should certainly be on your short list of next ones to check out by John Steinbeck. I read 3 works of crime fiction this month, 2 by Dennis Lehane and 1 by Michael Connelly. I can kind of talk about the Lehane books together. I read Prayers for Rain and Moonlight Mile. These are the 5th and 6th books in the Kenzie and Gennaro series, and the 5th and 6th are the last books in the Kenzie and Gennaro series. But one thing they really have in common is both of them are almost sequels to the 4th book, Gone Baby Gone, which in my opinion is one of Lehane's best. It's certainly the best in the Kenzie and Gennaro novels. And the end of that book has such a weight and heaviness to the storytelling that it really played a toll on these characters. And you see that in these stories, even though this one's 6 months later, so you would expect that to be a part of the narrative. But this is set 12 years later, and you still see the after effects of that book because of what happens in that book. So Prayers for Rain, as I mentioned, it's 6 months later, and you see Kenzie and J.R.R. are in very different places because of what happened at the end of Gone Baby Gone. And Kenzie finds himself in the middle of a crime that, frankly, is the strongest and most intelligent antagonist that he's come up against. And this book is really a lot of cat and mouse between Kenzie and this villain, who seems to be a step ahead, and then sometimes Kenzie's a step ahead, and it's kind of back and forth. And it culminates in a really big action sequence, which Lehane doesn't do that very often, but he does it very, very well in this book. And this is a great one. It's more in Lehane's kind of realm of the popcorn thriller rather than the literary thrillers that he tends to write sometimes. But I still really enjoyed it, and I think just the subtext of kind of the heaviness of where the characters are because of the dark elements at the end of Gone Baby Gone, I think elevates it a little bit above that of just a typical airport thriller that you would read. I really enjoyed Prayers for Rain. It's certainly a great installment in the Kenzie and Gennaro series. So Lehane took a big break after that. After the 5 Kenzie and Gennaro books, he wrote several other novels and didn't come back for another 11 years between Prayers for Rain and Moonlight Mile. And he came back to kind of finish Kenzie and Gennaro's story. This is set 11 years after Prayers for Rain, 12 years after Gone Baby Gone. And some of the ghosts of the past emerge. Some of the characters from Gone Baby Gone came back, and we are just revisited with some of the actions at the end of that book, which made it such a thought-provoking crime thriller. It's more slight than all the other novels. I mean, you can just tell by the size of it. It's certainly a shorter book. And it functions as really a nice coda at the end of the story with these characters as they find themselves just very changed by what's happened through their lives. You initially see them, we missed 11 years, and you get caught up in some big things that happen to both characters. But by the end of this, you realize just how far these characters have gone since the very beginning first book of Connelly's, of Lehane's. I'm going to talk about Connelly in a second. The one thing I have to say about Lehane in this series in general is I really tip my hat to him for ending the series, because crime thrillers, we know these are the big long series. I mean, there's like 30 Jack Reacher books and how many of these other big long detective novel series that we get, and he had the guts to end it. He also, I think, in many ways just followed his artistic ideas that he didn't want to continue that series, and he wanted to go different directions, and he went some fantastic directions in his career before finishing up this series in Moonlight Mile. Most of you know, if you're a past viewer, I am putting together a big Dennis Lehane video. Hopefully that's going to be out in December, where I'll talk about all of his books, give you some starting places, tier rank all the books as well. I hope you'll want to check out that video, but I did enjoy both of these books that concluded Dennis Lehane's Kenzie and J.R.R. detective series. So the new release that I read in October was The Waiting by Michael Connelly. This is Connelly's latest book. And the thing I always say about Michael Connelly is that Michael Connelly is the most consistently great author I've read, full stop. I don't even have to say in this genre or any genre, because he's just consistently good. I have 40 Connelly books on the shelf, and I can recommend every single one of them. It's amazing to me, the later books, though, how things are a little bit different, how he's able to put so much into his books in such an effortless manner. And I say effortless manner because I read a good amount of crime fiction, and I see some great authors, including my favorite author, sometimes dabble in this genre and just can't pull it off as well as this guy does every single time. This book has kind of 4 main stories going on. The A story is a really interesting one. This is a Renee Ballard. She's a detective. She is in charge of the open unsolved unit of the LAPD, and they got a DNA hit on a modern crime that points to a familial relationship with a serial killer that was not caught like decades before. And it was just fascinating following that. You know, Connelly updates all the science in his books and how this unsolved case, how that comes to fruition. That's kind of the A story. The B story is in the first chapter. Ballard's car is broken into and someone steals her badge and gun. And because of LAPD politics, she's afraid to report the crime for fear of getting fired, so she investigates on her own. This turns into a much bigger story where she has to bring in my favorite detective and some of yours, Detective Harry Bosch, who's long retired from the LAPD at this point, brings him into the story, into this really satisfying B story that kind of gets wrapped up earlier in the book. Then there's a great C story of Bosch's daughter who wants to volunteer and work with Ballard as both a female LAPD detective, as kind of a mentor, but also to look into unsolved cases. And the D story, yeah, it doesn't stop. Maddie Ballard may have solved the greatest case, the greatest mystery in LA history, in crime history. So it's amazing how he throws all 4 of those things together, and it's remarkable. This book, about 400 pages, I read the last 330 pages in one day because I just couldn't stop reading, because that's Connelly. I know when a Connelly book comes out, if I'm in a book slump, Connelly's going to cure it because he's just consistently great every single time. Let's move to the fantasy genre next and talk about The Last Light of the Sun by Gavriel Kay. This is Kay's Viking novel, which you can tell by the cover art here. This is set in Kay's version of the English Isles, and you get kind of the stand-ins for the Welsh and the Saxons and the Vikings. If you haven't read Kay before, Kay is often described as historical fiction with a quarter turn to the fantastical. I like to describe it a little differently. I like to say that it's historical fiction set in a fantasy world. And this world is actually the same world as some of Kay's other works, Lines of Al-Rassan, the Sarantine Mosaic, to name 2. And you see kind of some tie-ins there, which is really interesting to me. But the reason that I think calling it historical fiction is the manner of storytelling, something that Kay does that I love so well, is it's written like an historical novel, in that the narrator, whoever is telling the story, Kay himself usually, lets you know when an event is significant, when an event is important, and gives you kind of a bigger perspective rather than this is happening right now, but this happened long ago, and this is important, and this happened because. And for some reason, I just love that lens in which he tells these stories. This is a rare one for me for 2 reasons, though. The first one is that this took me longer to get into than any other Kay book. This is the 8th one by Kay that I've read, and the other 7, if I wasn't hooked in the prologue, I was hooked in chapter 1. This took about 90 pages for me to be hooked, but once I was hooked in, I loved this book from there to the end. And it just took a little bit longer. The other thing is, with the exception of Tigana, of the 8 works of Kay that I've read, this one had the most magic. And it was kind of a welcome difference from some of the other Kay books that I've read recently. And the kind of magic in this book was interesting in that it was kind of fairy magic. And that plays right into the folklore of the British Isles, and this is kind of the stand-in for the British Isles in this world. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it, and Kay wrote those passages just so beautifully. He wrote them with just a keen eye for just the atmosphere and the tone and the otherworldly nature of the magical scenes, and they were just so brilliantly done. So it's one of those that you don't get as much magic in Kay's books, at least from what I've read so far, but when you get it, it's so well done, like just about everything this guy does. You get a couple really great characters here. The character that emerges as kind of the central protagonist goes through quite a human journey in this story, from something that happens early on through where he ends up at the end. He goes through quite a lot in this story. And there's another character that has just a beautiful redemption arc. And it's amazing how Kay is always able to just kind of put a lot of different stories and just have them meaningfully converge at the end. It's so beautifully done. A couple other things I really enjoyed with this is there were some really great Easter eggs for those of us that have read the Sarantine Mosaic. Now, it's not important for you to have read that to love this book like I did, but it added a lot because you got little Easter egg type comments or allusions to different characters. This is in the same universe, set a couple centuries later. So just those little bits I really enjoyed. It's kind of like, those of you that like Sanderson when he gives you the little bit of Cosmere cross-world knowledge in his books where you enjoy it. Kay does this so well in his books. But Last Light of the Sun is, I think, one that people are sleeping on. I don't hear this talked about that often, but I really enjoyed it despite kind of a slower start for me. But once I got in, just the magic, the characters, the scope of the story became a new favorite for mine. So I definitely recommend The Last Light of the Sun by Gavriel Kay. I read Rise of a Merchant Prince by Raymond E. Feist last month. This is the second book in the Serpent War saga, and I was real high on the first book in that series. The Serpent War saga is kind of the fourth series I'm reading within the overall Rift War cycle. It takes place about 2 generations after the Rift War saga, the book series that began with Magician. And Rise of a Merchant Prince was unfortunately a miss for me. The second book here, so the first book told the story of Eric, and Eric's story was very coming of age as you see him as a young adult kind of coming into his own. Feist is at his best when he's telling adventure tales, and that's exactly what that was. And it was an adventure tale wrapped up in this great coming-of-age tale, and you saw a lot of growth from this character from beginning to the end. Well, Eric's friend Rue is the merchant prince in this story, and that's what it's about. Rue doesn't go on this coming-of-age tale. He just wants to get rich. And for one, I don't read fantasy to read a book that's 99% about commerce and business deals. Just not at any point in my life, in real life or in literature, anything that interests me are those two things. So I wasn't enjoying a lot of this book, which is a shame because I think this has some of his best writing. This is the 12th, 14th book by Feist that I've read, and the writing is great in here. It flows really well. I think even though the subject matter for me wasn't working, it was still a comparing narrative that propelled me along. So despite that, there's certainly a lot of good in here. Really, my biggest fault with this book was the ending. It almost felt like the last 50 pages, Feist realized that he hadn't moved forward the big story of the Serpent War saga pretty much at all in this book. So he almost dumps Rue's story and goes and tells all this other stuff that propels the story forward. But it felt really rushed, it felt tacked on, and it felt really disjunct because he had to then employ some magic to put people in the right places to be able to play out these scenes to tell the end of the story here. So this was a miss for me. Unfortunately, I think it was 12th book I've read by Feist, and this is probably number 12 for me. But I will say that I read the first 100 pages of the third book last night, so I'm really excited for the series as a whole, even if the second book was a rare miss from Raymond E. Feist for me. Let's talk next about The Gypsy by Stephen Brust and Megan Lindholm. Megan Lindholm is also Robin Hobb. Both of them are pseudonyms, if you didn't know that. This was an interesting book that frankly, it was kind of middling for me. It had a brilliant beginning, a brilliant ending, and then there was the middle. So let me tell you a little bit about this so maybe you can judge for yourself, because it is a short book, and I think a lot of people might like this book, and it's certainly a quick read, although I actually read Empire of Silence quicker than this book. Anyway, so the Gypsy has two kind of dual protagonists. One is the Gypsy, and he's kind of caught between worlds. He's caught between our world and kind of this magical world underneath, because this is urban fantasy. And in our world, he's kind of has amnesia, and in the other world, he kind of knows what's going on. And I really enjoyed the character, and it was very enigmatic character at the start, which I enjoyed. And then the second character is a detective who he's investigating a crime that perhaps the Gypsy has committed. And Gypsy has amnesia, so he doesn't even know if he's committed the crime or not. And there's kind of a cool interplay between the two characters that culminates in a really cool scene early in this book where we see one scene play out kind of in both worlds from each perspective. And I found it just really fascinating. But then, after that, my biggest problem with this book was just the plotting. This was told in super short passages. So I don't know if the authors alternated or how they wrote it or how they plotted it, but you would get like 4 chapters with the detective, and then you get like 2 chapters with somebody else. And then maybe, I say chapters, 4 pages with the detective, and then maybe 2 pages with somebody else, then maybe 3 pages with the Gypsy, and then a half page of a character you haven't met yet, and then you'd be back to the detective. And while some readers may find this helps the pages turn because you have these super short chapters, to be honest, I found it tedious, and I found it a chore to read at times. I found it exhausting, honestly, just bouncing around like we're playing tennis back and forth between all these point of views, several of which that don't really emerge to be important until the end of the book. So I really struggled with that. But the one thing I will say that I liked about the writing is I talked with Evie on her channel. She was only Evie. We did a buddy read of this and talked about this. And the thing that impressed both of us is that we couldn't tell where Lindholm wrote and Brust wrote. And sometimes you can tell that in books that kind of go back and forth. So that leads me to believe that I do want to try this author and maybe give him another shot, because of course I love Megan Lindholm / Robin Hobb, my favorite fantasy author. But the book itself didn't do it for me. The end of it was great, though. So it came together. So like the first 30 pages were brilliant. Last 30 pages were brilliant. The middle 200 didn't work for me, unfortunately. But I don't regret reading it. It was a short read. There were some things I liked about it. And I'll certainly read everything by Megan Lindholm, and I'll certainly read Stephen Brust at some point in the future as well. I read some Tolkien this month. I read Volume 4 of the History of Middle-earth, that is The Shaping of Middle-earth. And this, of course, is J.R.R. Tolkien, heavily edited by Christopher Tolkien. I'm going to set this down because it's huge and heavy. But The Shaping of Middle-earth is exactly what you would expect by a title like that, and then some. He tells you a lot of early tales. He tells you a lot of First Age tales. There's the early Silmarillion in here. There's a big passage called the Quenta, which is a lot of First Age history. You get the Annals of Valinor in here, which are really interesting. You get different versions of the stories that would eventually become the 3 Great Tales. All along the way, you get really, really great commentary by Christopher Tolkien, where he tells you not only where he found the different sources, about when they were written, how they differed, and he puts it all together. And the more I read these History Middle-earth, the more I just applaud Christopher Tolkien's work, because it's like historical scholarship. You see that all the work he's done to put all this together and to make it cohesive and to make it a narrative that actually makes sense. Additionally, there were cool things in here. There's a section called the Ambarkanta. I think that's what it's called. If it's wrong, I'll put it down here. And Tolkien had sketches, not of just Middle-earth, but of like the Earth, like the globe, and talking about the different spheres in the globe. So you can tell that early on, he was thinking so much bigger for him to tell his 2 or 3 stories that he put out in his lifetime. Now, I'll echo what I've said about, I read The Lays of Beleriand earlier this year. I'll echo my statement with that is, if you're a Tolkien completionist, you'll probably love this. If you're not, it's probably skippable. Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, must-reads. After that, Silmarillion, unfinished tales and the three great tales. After that, probably a lot of you could probably stop, unless you're like me, I'm a completionist. So I'll periodically read these. I am looking forward to The Lost Road and Other Writings, Volume 5, which I'll probably get to sometime early in 2025. My book of the month was Night Shift by Stephen King. This is a reread from about 30 years ago, and I was blown away by this. Many of you that are longtime viewers of the channel know that I always have a short story collection going concurrently with everything that I read. And when I finish a book as kind of a palate cleanser, I read one or two short stories. And in this one, I kept waiting for the bad one to fall, because there are 24 stories in here and like 19 or 20 of them are fantastic. What is also amazing, this is early King, and you see just kind of the scope already of what he's going to do. It's mostly horror, but you get a lot of different kind of, I guess, subsets of the horror genre in here. You get some very humanistic horror. You get some kind of possessed things type of horror. Just leave it at that. Possessed inanimate objects, I should say, is probably a little bit better. Probably my two favorites, though, there were two stories that tied into Salem's Lot. And one was a prequel, and it was written in an epistolary nature that I really enjoyed. Another one was a sequel of sorts, where a family breaks down on the highway at the exit next to Jerusalem's Lot, so you know that's probably not going to go well. That was fantastic. The Children of the Corn is in here, which is not really like the movie, but it was still fantastic. I mean, this is a strong, strong collection. And I hadn't picked it up in 30 years, and I didn't remember most of these stories. And I was so glad, because I just love the inventiveness of this. I love just kind of the bravery of early King. I think he's almost just very raw writer at this point, and I really love that aspect of early King. Look for a dedicated video on this. I started a short fiction series of Stephen King that I'm calling my Short Fiction Project, where I'm giving overviews of all of his short story collections and novella collections. This will only be the second installment. I started this when I read You Like It Darker a couple months ago. But I look forward to doing those, so check that out if you want to hear a few more details about Night Shift, including my favorite stories from this one and the ones I consider some of my all-time favorites, because there are some all-time favorites in this. But my book of the month, out of all these great authors, all these 10 great books, was by my favorite author, Stephen King. Night Shift, my book of the month, October 2024. So, hey, I hope you enjoyed this wrap-up. Let me know if you've read any of these. I'd love to talk with you in the comments section below. But as always, please label any spoilers in case anybody hasn't read these goes into the comment section. And I'd love to hear what your book of the month was. Let me know that as well. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.